Here's a question that sounds like a joke until you actually think about it. Humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Toilet paper has existed for less than 200. So what were the other 299,800 years actually like? Short answer, they absolutely did clean up. The idea that ancient humans just didn't is one of those internet myths that sounds funny but falls apart the second you look at the actual evidence. What's genuinely wild isn't that they skipped it, it's what they used instead, and just how far back in the archaeological and historical record we can actually trace it. Let's start with the assumption most people carry without questioning it, that before toilet paper there was basically nothing, just discomfort and bad hygiene for hundreds of thousands of years. That assumption doesn't survive contact with the evidence. Humans are remarkably consistent about solving uncomfortable problems, and this is one of the oldest, most universal problems there is. Every documented culture we know of developed some method. The materials just varied wildly depending on what was locally available. Start with what prehistoric humans most likely had access to, since this is the hardest part to prove directly. Organic materials like leaves, moss, grass, and smooth stones don't survive well in the archaeological record. They decompose, they don't fossilize, and they don't show up neatly labeled in a dig site the way a stone tool does. So archaeologists can't point to a single preserved artifact and say, this is exactly what a hunter-gatherer used 50,000 years ago. What they can do is look at what materials were abundant, absorbent, and already part of daily use for other purposes, and reasonably infer that the same materials, particularly broad leaves, soft moss, and smooth river stones, were the logical first tools. This is an evidence-informed inference, not a confirmed fact, and any honest archaeologist will tell you the direct proof from that deep in prehistory simply hasn't survived. Here's where it gets interesting, though, because once we hit written history and preserved artifacts, the picture becomes dramatically clearer, and one discovery in particular is almost too specific to be believed. The ancient Romans left behind something called a tersorium, more commonly nicknamed the silospongium, literally a sea sponge attached to a stick. Archaeological finds and Roman-era writings confirm that public latrines, including communal ones excavated at sites across the empire, featured shared sponge sticks kept in a bucket of salt water or vinegar between uses, positioned within reach of a shared stone bench with keyhole-shaped openings cut into it. Multiple people, sitting side by side in what was very much a social experience, used the same communal sponge, rinsed and reused. Roman writer Seneca even referenced the device directly in a letter, describing it in the context of a gladiator who used the stick end of one to end his own life, rather than face the arena, which is honestly one of the darker footnotes in ancient hygiene history. But it does confirm the object was common and well known enough that Roman readers didn't need it explained. Now here's the part nobody talks about. The wealthy in Rome had an alternative. Historical texts reference wool soaked in rosewater as a more comfortable, private option for those who could afford it, while the communal sponge remained the standard for everyone else. Hygiene, even in antiquity, tracked pretty closely with social class. Moving further east, ancient China developed a completely different solution, and this one comes with unusually solid physical evidence. Archaeologists excavating Han Dynasty-era latrine sites, including a well-documented dig connected to the tomb of a king dated to around 2,000 years ago, have recovered actual preserved wooden and bamboo sticks, known as chuugi, wrapped in cloth at one end, used specifically for personal cleaning and clearly designed to be reusable. These aren't inferred from context. They're physical objects pulled directly from the ground, which makes this one of the most solidly confirmed ancient hygiene methods we have anywhere in the archaeological record. Paper eventually replaced these sticks in China by roughly the 6th century CE, making China one of the earliest civilizations to develop dedicated paper specifically for this purpose, centuries before it caught on almost anywhere else in the world. Here's a layer that connects to something bigger. Religious and cultural texts across completely unrelated civilizations independently converged on water as the preferred method. Not cloth, not paper, not sponges. Islamic hygiene practices, documented extensively in hadith literature dating back over 1,400 years, specifically recommend washing with water as the primary method, a practice still followed by roughly 2 billion people today across large parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa. Traditional practices across India and much of Southeast Asia developed similarly, independently, centered on water rather than dry materials. This wasn't cultural borrowing. It's convergent hygiene, unrelated civilizations, separated by thousands of miles with no contact, arriving at remarkably similar conclusions about what actually works best. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, things got noticeably less sophisticated for several centuries. Historical records and surviving texts reference moss, hay, leaves, and eventually, once it became cheap and widely available, torn scraps of cloth or old rags. There's no glamorous secret Roman-level technology here. European hygiene tools during this period were largely whatever was cheap, absorbent, and within arm's reach, which honestly tracks with how most low-cost technology develops throughout history, not through innovation, but through whatever's most convenient in the moment. Which brings us to a genuinely wild final layer: corn cobs. In parts of colonial and early rural America, corn cobs were a documented, widely used tool. Cheap, abundant, and, according to first-hand historical accounts, apparently effective enough to remain in common use well into the 19th century in many rural households, particularly before mass-produced paper products became affordable and widely distributed. And that finally brings us to actual toilet paper as we recognize it today, which is astonishingly recent. Dedicated toilet paper existed in China as early as the 6th century, as mentioned earlier, but it took over 1,000 years to spread meaningfully beyond that region. In the West, the first commercially packaged toilet paper wasn't sold until 1857 by Joseph Gaetti in the United States, marketed as medicated paper containing aloe, sold in individual flat sheets rather than a roll. It was expensive, considered somewhat shameful to purchase openly, and it didn't sell particularly well at first. The perforated roll format most people recognize today wasn't patented until 1891 by Seth Wheeler. Even then, it took decades of gradual adoption, shifting social attitudes, and improving affordability before it became the default assumption most people carry today, that this is simply how it's always been done. So, here's the honest summary. Ancient humans absolutely cleaned up, using an enormous range of solutions shaped almost entirely by what was locally available, culturally normalized, and economically accessible in their specific time and place. Water in one region, sponges in another, wooden sticks in a third, corn cobs in a fourth. What looks like one universal modern default, a soft roll of paper reached for without a second thought, is actually the newest, narrowest solution in a genuinely enormous, globally diverse historical record. And here's the part that connects back to you. Standing in your own bathroom, reaching automatically for something that took thousands of years, dozens of independent civilizations, and one specifically unglamorous chain of trial and error to finally arrive at. The next time that roll runs out at the worst possible moment, remember, your ancestors solved this same problem with sponges on sticks, bamboo wrapped in cloth, wool soaked in rosewater, and, for a genuinely surprising number of people not that long ago, dried corn cobs. Somehow, humanity survived every single version of this problem. This is simply the version you happen to be born into.